Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the US adds its voice to international concerns that Rwanda is backing efforts to destabilize Burundi. Top diplomats say they've seen reports from the field. Also, prosecutors ask for life should former Chadian dictator Hissène Habré be found guilty of war crimes charges. The landmark case is expected to wrap up in Senegal this week. And kicked out and living on the streets. We speak to some of the Congolese families struggling to pick themselves up after having been forced out of Congo-Brazzaville in a crackdown 2 years ago. Now, the US government has added its voice to growing international concerns that Rwanda's government may be fanning the flames of Burundi's crisis. On Wednesday, Washington's Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs notified a congressional hearing of reports from our colleagues in the field suggesting that Rwanda is deliberately destabilizing its neighbor. Now, Burundi was plunged into crisis in late April last year after President Pierre Nkurunziza first announced what was to be a successful bid for a third term in office. Since then, clashes between his supporters and opponents have left hundreds dead, prompted a coup and a crackdown by security forces. Our regional correspondent, Duncan Woodside's in Kigali. He joins us now with more. Duncan, so recently we saw UN experts making similar accusations against Rwanda. Kigali denied them. Can they brush off the US's concerns so easily?
Well, perhaps not quite so easily, no. Obviously, there is a history of enmity between the UN group of experts in in Congo, vis-à-vis the government in Rwanda. The Rwandan government has habitually claimed that this group of experts is biased against them. But it's a bit of a different case with the US government. The US government, of course, has been historically strongly quite aligned with the Rwandan government, so they can't really dismiss claims coming from the US authorities in quite the same manner. But there is a growing cacophony of voices, as you say, in terms of allegations leveled against Rwanda vis-à-vis intervention or alleged intervention in Burundi since the beginning of that political crisis. We've had reports from Refugees International, for example, who in December went into the Mahama refugee camp in Rwanda and alleged that there was recruitment taking place backed by Rwandan military authorities. And also a report from my colleague Thais Brook here in Rwanda for France 24. He went in earlier in November and broadcast a report on the same allegations. So obviously, as these allegations mount, it becomes increasingly difficult for Rwanda to deflect attention away from them.
So, Duncan, you were covering the African Union summit for us in Addis recently. Burundi was very much topping the agenda there. Any sign that since then, any possibility of a solution to Burundi's crisis might be provided by other African states?
Well, of course, there was this communique by the African Union's Peace and Security Council back in December, very strongly worded communique, which seemed to set up an intervention, a peacekeeping intervention, almost as a fait accompli at that stage. Up to 5,000 troops were due to be deployed. But since then, we've had a meeting of the heads of state at the end of January, and prior to that, another meeting of the Peace and Security Council, and there were 12 African heads of state present at that meeting of the Security Council on the last Friday of January. And all of those heads of state reportedly opposed any kind of intervention in Burundi against the government's will, which now means it's very difficult for the African Union to take any kind of substantive action. They are sending a delegation to Bujumbura. We don't have a timeline for that. It's comprised of 5 heads of state, including Jacob Zuma of South Africa. But really and honestly, they've kind of lost their firepower. They've lost their gravitas on this matter in a context where they say that they will defer to the will of Burundi's government in terms of the issue of peacekeepers. And that comes in a context, of course, where there are serious allegations of extrajudicial killings and summary executions by the security forces in Burundi over the last few months.
Thanks very much. Duncan Woodside there for us in Kigali. Now, heading to Nigeria, the death toll from a twin suicide bombing in the northeast has risen to 58. The blast happened on Tuesday morning in Dikwa, not far from Maiduguri. 2 women are thought to have been responsible for detonating the devices in the middle of a displaced persons camp. No one's yet claimed responsibility, but the attack does bear the hallmarks of Boko Haram insurgents. In Senegal, prosecutors in the war crimes trial against former Chadian strongman Hissène Habré have asked that he be given a life sentence if convicted. Habré is the first former African head of state to be tried by a domestic court from elsewhere on the continent. Investigators reckon that over 40,000 people were killed under his rule before he was toppled in 1990. Now, the case is expected to wrap up this week. Colin Baker has been following proceedings for us. He joins us now. Colin, this is the final chapter of what's been a long legal wait for Habré's alleged victims. What have these last days been about?
Well, the beginning of the week was about emotion, but today it was really about the facts of the case. On Monday and Tuesday, we heard lawyers who represent the victims here of Hissène Habré's regime give these fiery, passionate, deeply personal arguments. They appealed to the bravery of these victims who told harrowing stories, and also to the historic nature of this case, which is really a first for Africa. Today was different. Today, the prosecution presented specific evidence for war crimes and for crimes against humanity. They were trying to draw the judge's focus onto events that may have actually had President Habré's fingerprints on them, which has been notoriously difficult to do throughout this whole case. So they argued that a few specific massacres of civilians and prisoners of war, which have been well documented and supported by witness testimony, could not have happened without Habré's awareness, and thus making him the guilty party. And then in some really shocking language, they also accused him of personally raping one of his own prisoners 4 times. That evidence came from victims' testimony late last year. It was a long day, 8 hours of argument, and at the end, the prosecutor simply said the court requests life in prison for Mr. Habré. Tomorrow, we hear from the defense, who will try to discredit the witnesses, and after that, the judges go away for 3 months to make their decision.
Thanks very much. Colin Baker there for us, and he'll be joining us again tomorrow with what may be the final days of Hissène Habré's trial in Senegal. Well, activists in Kinshasa are trying to get authorities to do more to help Congolese families expelled from neighbouring Brazzaville. Tens of thousands were forced out in a crackdown that began a couple of years ago. Some of those who returned to Democratic Republic of Congo are still struggling.
Between the street and the gutter, this is where some of the DR Congo nationals who were expelled from Brazzaville 2 years ago now live. Conditions are appalling.
Life is hard. We're only able to survive thanks to the people who pass by and bring us rice, soap and clothes. Because we have no money. We have absolutely nothing.
2 years ago, Francois set up a support group called the Expelled from Brazzaville Collective. He says he's trying hard to get support from the authorities, but so far he hasn't had any luck.
I regularly write to the authorities to give them information about what's happening here, but I still haven't heard from them. I write to them hoping they'll answer. We even hold meetings with the Secretary General or Minister's advisors. But the situation remains the same. We even wrote to the President and Human Rights Commission.
In 2014, more than 140,000 DRC citizens were kicked out of neighboring Congo. There they were blamed by Brazzaville authorities for a rise in local crime. Back in Kinshasa, the DR Congo government offered some support to those returning, but many still live in precarious conditions. The government says these families refused its help.
We offered to bring them back to their families and hometowns. It seems to me that it's their decision to accept or not. But apparently, they chose the easiest option, thinking they'd get more help.
The government is considering compensating those who lost everything. But in the meantime, life on the street is cruel. Several people are believed to have died in the last few months.
That report by our Thomas Nicolas in Kinshasa. That is, though, where we're going to have to leave it for now for Eye on Africa. Do stay with us, though. A short break, and more coming up. Take care.
Down to Earth.
This week, we're down to earth in England. This isn't just a casual walk along London's River Thames. I'm with an award-winning university group who have a goal to clean up the world's dirtiest waterways. They think they can make plastic disappear. sounds like magic, but it's just the type of project that could be possible under a radical new way of doing science.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.